he's a local author and a historian, and he's published, these are only two of my collection of Dane Love books, but he's published quite a host of them. They're all extremely interesting. And I've asked him tonight if he would talk about Cumnock Square.
You broke my heart.
Okay, over to you, Dane. Can you give Dane control, Neil, please?
You can share your screen.
Okay, you all hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Okay.
Well, good evening, folks. I'll just start sharing the screen. Hopefully, we'll get it going easy enough. I think that's us about nearly there. No, hold on. I've actually done this talk to the history group about 5-6 years ago, maybe, when we were in the MERCAT Hotel at that time. And what I did then was I started with a wee quiz on the square, because half the folk in Cumnock don't know much about the square. And to be honest with you, quite a lot of folk who were thinking they knew about the square discovered they didn't. So because this is basically the same talk with a few updates, what I'm just going to do is use the same PowerPoint and we'll do the quiz to start with. There's no prizes this time because I'm not actually there in person, so I can't give out anything. But if you want to have a wee bit of paper and pencil, that's up to you. I wouldn't worry about it too much. I'll just batter through the questions. So, question number 1 was, where is this plaque to be found on the square? You maybe recognise it. It's actually a different colour since that was taken.
It's on the Royal Hotel
I
building.
don't tell folk, keep your mouth shut now.
Oh, sorry. Sorry,
question
Dane.
number 2 is, what does it actually mean? Now, if you look at it closely, the letters are CTC. Okay, question number 3. What's the newest building in the square? We all think it's quite an old place, but what's the newest building in the square? And number 4, when was the half of the square closed off to traffic? Now, I remember it being open, but try and work out what year it would be. And whereabouts is this carving to be found in the square? You don't need to tell me what it means in this case, but if you know, that's a bonus to you. Number 6, whose coat of arms is this? Number 7, where was the wheat sheaf in? Number 8, what building in the square was known for a time as the Glasgow House? Number 9, Cumnock's jail was in the square at one time. What's on the site of it now? And when was the square first covered in tarmac Adam? So I'll tell you the answers at the end. Some of the answers will come up through the talk as we go through it. But just to see how many of you know the square. So here we have 1857 Ordnance Survey, the first kind of detailed Ordnance Survey map that was made at the time. 25 inch to the mile was when it was surveyed. And you can see the squares there right in the centre with the church, cruciform shape, which is not the actual church that's there today. This is the older church. And as you can see, it's called the square in its marketplace. The cross is the market cross, obviously, which is in a slightly different position to where it is today, more or less in line with the front door of the church and in line with Clydesdale Close. And if you go to the north side of the square, at the top end of it, you'll see Congregational Chapel, which some folk didn't appreciate either. Moving on a wee bit, 1896, you can see the size of the church in the middle has changed, and that's because it's now the present church that's occupying that site. And you can also see the cross still in the same position at that point. Basically what we're going to do now is have a walk around the square, looking at every building, starting from number 1 up to number 46, I think it goes to. And we'll have a wee discussion about the history of what was in the places and so on. As I say, number one is this building here at the corner of Clydesdale Street, and it's known technically as the Commercial Bank Buildings, because when it was built as the Commercial Bank of Scotland. However, before that was built, there were two other shop premises on that site, because technically it's number one and number two, the square. You can see it's RD Hunter sign, it's up there, but it's now DW Shaw. That building was erected in 1926 to 28 for, as I say, the Commercial Bank of Scotland, and that is actually the newest building in the square. There's nothing newer than that. There's a house that's been built there anyway. If we get back before that, before 1926 time, it was still occupied by the Hunters. There's actually two brothers, Thomas and William, who occupied the two buildings and also the upstairs part. And I believe they were Hunters from New Cumnock, who came to Cumnock and started the shops here. And if you go to some of the older photographs, this is the same place. It's actually been occupied by the bank. Now, although Hunters had it to start with, one of the Hunters was actually an agent for the Commercial Bank, and he sold the building to the Commercial Bank, who rebuilt it, and then they obviously used the offices upstairs. This photograph here is back at the time of Thomas Hunter and William Hunter, but before that, in the 1850s, it was actually occupied by a David Shields. Now, he ran an ironmongery from this, and this was also Cumnock Post Office at that time. It remained the post office up until 1880, when it actually moved to a site in Ayr Road, next to where I would talk about in my youth as Borlands. And from Ayr Road, it then moved to Lugar Street, to the present building it's in. But as I say, it was a post office up until 1880, and David Shields that ran it, he actually went bankrupt and caused a wee bit of an issue. His son took over for a few years, and then it was given up after that. William Hunter, as I say, one of the Hunter brothers came here, and he made bicycles, probably just assembled them, to be honest with you. I don't think he physically made the frames, but he might have. Quite a lot of bike manufacturers trying to make bikes in different towns, and he sold them under the name Ballach Mile or Afton bicycles. And in 1903, he opened Hunter's Garage elsewhere in Cumnock, and he started selling Humber cars. As I say, obviously after that it became Commercial Bank and what we all think of as RD Hunters. And there's an old advert for the Hunter brothers. Next door, number 3, is the downstairs bit that's actually part of DW Shaws now, where they sell the houses. The oldest information I've got on this is from the 1850s, when William McGeechan had an ironmongery business in that shop, and his business was established in 1832. Now, I can't confirm it was in that shop in 1832, but there's a fair chance it was. He was an ironmonger, as I say, a furnisher, and also a watchmaker. He died in 1883, and his son, who also appears to be William, took over. And when he died in 1903, William Ritchie became the ironmonger in that building. I reckon this is probably one of the oldest buildings in the square, just going by the appearance and the style, especially when you get around the back and look at the stonework on it. Whether the front was rebuilt at some point, I don't know, but it's slightly more modern looking than what the back is. Number 4, the square is actually the upstairs part of this building, and for many years this was Cumnock Gospel Hall, or at least one of them. The first assembly in Cumnock started in the 1840s, but it appears to have died out some point thereafter. And before 1892, a new assembly of Brethren started up, and initially they met in the town hall. The Brethren was reformed in 1920, and it's possibly that's roughly when this became the Gospel Hall, and it remained as such until 1995. It's now currently offices, one of them's up for sale at the moment. You can see that the photograph there's an older one, because they did this talk a few years ago. It was Oak House Mortgages that was downstairs. If I was updating my PowerPoint, I realised just how many buildings in the square have changed hands in the last 4 or 5 years already. Number 5, currently Words of Wisdom, but the oldest information I've got, this was Drummond's The Draper, and it appeared to be a variety of drapers over the years thereafter. There was D.C. Smith, the draper, about 1900. John Miller took over, and then in 1912, this became the property of Greenlees and Sons. And Greenlees and Sons was kind of, well, shoemakers, and they had the Easy Fit brand, and this was the Easy Fit shop in Cumnock for many years. In more recent times, it was actually an off sales for a wee while, and then the church bought it, and it became the church cafe and bookshop. Another part of Words of Wisdom building here is number 6, the square, and if you go round the back of it, there's actually a kind of circular. Does everyone else see my internet's unstable? I don't know if that's just my computer that shows that. Never mind. The oldest information I've got here is George Moore was a clock and watchmaker in this building, and he obviously was in there for a couple of years. And then it was Cadam McClure, who was a tobacconist and confectioner in it, and his daughter Jessie McClure took over by the 60s. When I was a wee boy, this was Mr. Jimmy McDougall's fruit shop, and I remember going in there quite often to get stuff for my mother. And then somebody white had a fruit shop in it in fairly recent times, and as I say, it's now part of Words of Wisdom. Cadam McClure, who was in it at one point, he is the person after whom Caddy's Close, which is the wee gap to the right, was named after. Some folk that don't know much about the history of the place think of the caddies in Edinburgh, who have a kind of old taxi type service, and folks seem to think that was perhaps how the name got it. But probably it's not, it's Caddy McClure. And as I say, Jimmy McDougall had the shop when I was a wee boy, and you can see in the advert there, number 6 was the fruit shop, and number 3, who we've already mentioned, that was actually his flower shop at one time. As I say, I've already mentioned Caddy's Close. Number 7, again, this was George Moore, the watchmaker. I don't know whether he moved from one to the other, but certainly it was on the go in the 1850s. He died in 1864, and his son, Alexander Moore, took over. But in 1868, he gave up the business, and Robert Black took it on, continued as a watchmaker and a jeweller. And in 1887, the shop was taken over by Robert Crawford, who again was a clockmaker and jeweller in the place. 1926, James Brown, a jeweller from Catherine, took it on, and he remained for a few years, but the most longest serving person in there was probably Ronald Robertson, who was a watchmaker and jeweller there for many, many years, and certainly, as I keep going back to my youth, that was the occupant of the shop at that time. In more recent years, this shop's been a variety of things. It's been the Square Record shop, there was Images clothing shop, and it's currently a beauty salon. And here we have an old advert for Robert Crawford, which obviously predates 1926. Same building, but next door, number 8. If you go back to the 1860s, 1868, Mr. Houston opened up a grocery in this building, in this shop here, and he ran it for 40 years until 1908, when William Carrick took over as a grocer in the same place. In 1914, this became the Mrs. Bryce dressmakers, ladies' outfitters, and a milliner's shop, and it was then taken over by a Miss Elizabeth Laidlaw. Latterly, this was also part of Ronald Robertson's Jewellers, because he actually had the 2 shops at the same time, and the frontage of them was a nice Victorian style wooden timber front. Unfortunately, Marmaris in the last 2 or 3 months almost took a bit of that off and stuck these big blue plastic things down the front, which has wasted the appearance of it a fair bit. Going to number 9 in the square, I'm moving next door. The oldest I've got for this one is about the 1880s when T. Watson, also Thomas Watson, had a boot and shoe shop in it. Now, he was actually in the shop before James McGrady took it on. Now, the McGradys in Cumnock were famous for their boots and shoes for many, many years. That wouldn't have closed down the last 2 or 3 years ago when they demolished the precinct. But by the 1890s, James McGrady had a shop in here. Now, the biggest problem was he had a brother, John McGrady, and the two of them had shoe shops, and both of them fell out at one time, and it seems to have been a kind of serious falling out, and they talked to each other thereafter. Before Cumnock actually had street numbers, which I believe was of 1903, they introduced street numbers. When you put an advert in the paper for the Jai McGrady shoe shop, then people didn't know exactly which one it was. So if you look at some of the old adverts in the Chronicle or thereabouts, what he actually did was he says it's Jai McGrady next door to such and such, or Jai McGrady next to the Royal Hotel, etc., just so you knew which one it was and to make sure you went to the right shop. So as I say, in here it was James McGrady that was in there for many years, right up into the 60s. It was McGrady's shoe shop. And since the 1990s, it's actually been Carpets Plus shop in that one there. Upstairs in this shop here is a house currently known as Black Gates. And again, this one's actually up for sale at the moment. Whether it's Black Gates historically, I don't know, but certainly that's the name it goes under. Number 11 is now the Sovereign Credit Union. But if you go way back, this was a fishmonger's, and the oldest fishmonger I can find in it is John Wright, who was actually a Cumnock fish salesman and came to Cumnock and opened up a shop here. By the 1890s, it was Bingham's, the fishmonger, and they seem to have been here for 20 to 30 years. And Bingham's, the off licence, and David Bingham, the Chronicle photographer at one time, are all part of the same family. In 1929, the shop was taken over by a Robert Hopkins, and he ran a fruit shop in it. And it was taken over by Mrs. Turnbull as a fruit shop as well. And then, because the building, I think, was all owned by the McGradys, Nan McGrady opened up as a ladies' footwear shop in here. Today, as I say, it's part of the Sovereign Credit Union. And here's an old advert for Nan McGrady, probably a 60s advert, I think, if I remember correctly. The big building next door is quite a substantial one, probably more important than what we think. I've never been able to identify exactly when it was built and who built it, but something makes me think it's a more important building than the rest of them. Maybe somebody can enlighten us, I don't know. However, one of its oldest names is the Old Apothecaries Hall. Now, I don't know whether it was built as the Old Apothecaries Hall or whether that was just the name it got later on. But at one time, this was a chemist's, certainly number 12, the left-hand side of it, and it was a W.O.K. and Son. It was a chemist in here. Now, the business was re-designated in 1924 when it was established with £1,000 in capital and £1 shares. And that, as I say, that survived for a number of years, and then he moved elsewhere. The left-hand building was a seafood restaurant for a while. Donnelly took it over as a restaurant, and then Rutherford's had it as a restaurant. But by the late 50s, it was the South of Scotland Electricity Board office and shop, which most of us probably remember it as the Electricity Board showroom. And for a number of years, it was empty. The Council for Voluntary Organisations had it as an office for a wee while. And then in 2012, Linda Bryce opened it up as a newsagent. And I think it was 2017 she sold it. It still trades under the Bryce name. Next door, I'll just go back, sorry. Oh, my way. Next door and number 14, because number 13 would be upstairs. Number 14 was Mr. Gibbs and Confectioners, and then Mrs. Matheson and Agnes Neal, and then again it became part of WK's Apothecaries Hall. Now he lived down the home at a house called Coyle and Togo, and he died in 1924. And unfortunately his son, who was expected to take over, died a few weeks before him. On the right hand side, William Buck had a barbers for a wee while, and then as I say, eventually it became the electricity board. Next to that, there were two other shops that were actually technically part of the square because they had numbers that tied in with the square at the top of the pond steps. The one on the left hand side here, number 15, if you go back to the 1920s, it was the Cumnock brothers who had it as grocers and wine merchants. And then Samuel Galbraith had a grocery in it, and Galbraith's, folk will probably remember that as a kind of Cumnock supermarket type thing for a number of years, but that's where they started in that wee shop there. And as I say, it basically passed down through a variety of wee grocers and stuff until it's demolished. Next door, number 17, because number 16 was upstairs, as 1850s, Robert McAvale had a shoe shop here, and then by the 1870s, David Cree had a pawn shop in that building in the corner here, and obviously that is why we get the term the pawn stairs or pawn steps. So David Cree was in 1879, roughly, and before that probably, till about 1900, so when the pawn steps get the name. When he gave it up, John Kernahan was a pawnbroker in there, and he lived in Ayr Road. And then Andrew Ordusky McCall had a new restaurant in it, and then it became the Green and Cleaners. And probably in the 1960s, late 1960s, it was demolished. I don't actually have the date to hand for that. But disappeared about then and opened up the corner of the square. This is one of the old drawings that was in R.D. Hunter's from the 60s when the place was being considered for renovation. And as you can see there, it's the Green and Cleaners. It's on the right hand side where the steps go down. Now the pawn steps, obviously rebuilt after those two buildings were demolished. But if you get back in some of the older accounts, they weren't called the pawn steps. The wee gap there was called the Needle Z, just a narrow space between the buildings there. And latterly, they're also known as just the stairs, probably before the pawn shop opened up. Moving round to the west side of the square, number 18. The earliest I've got in this building is Mr. Dick Draper, who was on the left-hand side. And then in 1902, this wee shop was taken over by Brackenridge and Henderson, the Drapers. Now, most of us of a certain vintage will remember Brackenridge and Henderson from Ayr Road, but they actually started off their business here in 1902, and they were here for 4 years before they moved to Ayr Road. After that, there was a Mrs. Matheson of the shop, and then it was taken over in 1928 and opened up as the Buttercup Dairy, which was obviously a chain of dairies all over Scotland at the time. The Buttercup Dairy was only there for a few years because they actually moved to Lesnut Street to a bigger shop. And a lot of folk, if they remember the Buttercup Dairy at all in Cumnock, always think it was Lesnut Street. But latterly it was McJinnett's. It was McJinnett's when I was a wee boy. And then it became the New City Chinese carryout, and it's been that for a good number of years now. However, if you get into the Chinese and you look at the step as you get in, you can see the Buttercup Dairy Company, quite a nice mosaic on the ground as you step in. And if you look on the right hand side, just inside the door, there is an original Buttercup Dairy Company ceramic tile image on the right hand side there. So even although it was only there for a few years, there's quite a few things commemorating. And obviously something quite a rare thing nowadays, that something should be kept. I said Mrs. Matheson was in there for a wee while, between 1906 and 1928, as a fruiterer and a confectioner. Now, the rest of the building there, the upstairs part of it, or the whole thing, is actually called Clydesdale House. Now, that building, we actually know the date of it, even though it isn't dated on, there's no date stones or anything, but this was built in 1846 for the Western Bank of Scotland. The Western Bank didn't do too well because by 1860 they were out of the game. They tried to merge with another bank, I can't remember the name just now. Yeah, but they were trying to merge at the time, but they sold this in 1857 to the Clydesdale Banking Company. So that's where the Clydesdale Bank opened up in Cumnock. In 1883, the Clydesdale sold this when they moved to their other building, and it was sold to David Brown Cree, the pawnbroker, and he actually owned it for a number of years. In 1901, the whole building was put up for sale at £1,100. I'm not sure if it was actually sold at that point, but that's the figures they were looking for. And here we have the same building when McJinnett's had it for a few years. It's probably a 40s, 50s photograph. The right-hand side of that building, number 20, was originally G.B. Cree, who was one of the same family as David Brown Cree, the pawnbroker, but he was a baker and he had his baker's shop in here up until 1928. In 1928, James Spears took over as the baker in the shop there, and then James Hamilton, the fruiterer, had it. By the 50s, it was McJinnett's, and when I was a boy, it was Anne's. Anne McJinnett had it, and she sold like wool for knitting, lingerie, knitwear, baby linen, and that type of stuff. In about the 1980s, it was a card shop owned by Mrs. Threlfall, and for a short period, Ayrshire Memorials were in there, Dick's Barber Shop, the Square Salon in recent years, and it's currently Julie's Barbers. And here's another old advert for George Cree, the baker, who was in that building there. Moving next door to number 21, currently occupied by Chilly Tonight, with a big black facade, unfortunately. But the earliest I've got here, up until 1880, this was occupied by James McInnes, who was a grocer. And when he died, Mrs. McInnes kept it going, and she sold vegetables and home baking. By 1890s, and certainly up until 1927, this was the shop of John Borland, who sold vegetables and fancy goods. And in 1880, it was sold for £350. 1927, James Galloway opened up his chemist shop in here, and it became part of the bigger Galloway shop, and then Coburn, the chemist, in the 70s. It was empty for a good number of years, and then Biljo's opened up as a fish and chip shop, and it closed for 2 years, and then Dalglish's had a chip shop in it for a year almost, and then it was shut again for another 3 years, and since 2018, Chilly Tonight has been in it. And yeah, an old Galloway's chemist advert. Now, if you remember the quiz at the start, this is the Glasgow House in Cumnock, number 22. Now, this building was built in 1885, and it was built for a man called David Eaglesham Cooperthwaite, who came from Maybole. He had a shop in Maybole, and he was expanding, and he got the ground here, and he rebuilt a big shop in it. And when he built it, it was called Church Square House, just to kind of emphasise the size of it. The architect who designed this was actually the Provost of Cumnock, James Richmond, who was an architect of some standing of some sort, and he also was a builder in the town, and he built that for Cooperthwaite. Before that, in the 1870s, there was a wee sweetie shop on site, run by a Marion Baird. But in 1872, it was actually David Cooperthwaite who opened up his drapery business in it. And he ran it in the old building until they built this new one. Cooperthwaite gave it up in 1904, and it was taken over by a partnership of John Miller and Donald Cameron. And they renamed it as the Glasgow House, and they ran it as the Glasgow House for 6 years. And the reason it was called the Glasgow House was they went to Glasgow and bought up all the latest fashions in clothing and brought it back to Cumnock, so you could buy Glasgow fashions in Cumnock without having to leave the place. In 1910, they actually fell out, I believe, and one of them moved to Lugar Street, and the other one struggled on for a wee while. But by 1910, as I say, then it was changed to the Polytechnic, which is just a big fancy name for a kind of shop that sold a bit of everything. And it remained the Polytechnic up until 1927, when galleries took it on. And it's been empty almost since the chemist went out of it, which is unfortunate. It's one of the more striking buildings in the town. I actually used to know someone who lived in the flat upstairs, and they said it was actually a very nice flat. Unfortunately, you couldn't get anybody to buy it off them. Old advert for the Polytechnic, and as you can look at down the bottom there, before we had street numbers, you described your house, so it's the large 3-storey building in the square. And there's the old Glasgow House style logo. Number 23, everybody in Cumnock will still refer to this as the Sun Inn, but it has been renamed the Victoria Inn since 2019. Never heard anybody really call it that yet, never mind. This, if it's not the other building in the square, this will be one of the oldest as well. And if you go around the back of it and look at the stonework, you can see the outlines of older, smaller windows, etc. have all been built up, covered over the years. Earliest information I've got on it was by James McClanahan, who was McClanachans of the farming family. He had it up until 1875 when he died, and then Mrs. McClanahan ran it for a while after that. It was owned by the Frieshouse Estate, and it remained their property up until 1899. But to be honest with you, probably an awful lot of other buildings in the square were owned by the Frieshouse Estate as well. Just I don't always have confirmation of that. In 1899, the estate put it up for sale at an offers over £400, and it was bought by an Alexander Harrison Kirtland. Now, the biggest problem was Mrs. Watson, who was the landlady at the time, refused to leave, and she ran it for a couple of years until he managed to get her out, and then Alexander, or Alex Kirtland, ran it thereafter. In 1911, it was taken over by a William Gilchrist of Glasgow. He only had it for 2 or 3 years, then it was a John Ward. Then a William Ferguson in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. He actually owned a hotel in Castle Douglas. He bought this one here as well. In more recent years, Robert Kyle actually owned that. And since 2014, it has been owned by a national chain of pubs and so on called Hawthorne Leisure, and basically they either lease it to folk who want to run it as a pub or whatever. So as I say, that's the Sun. If you look at it and you see the door on the left with the windows to either side and 3 windows upstairs, and you look up to the roof, on the right hand side there's a chimney above the sign. Well, between the 2 chimneys there's actually a house, and that's why there's another door into the Sun there, with 1 window into the square and a window upstairs. I don't think that's ever been any commercial premises until it was taken over as part of the Sun Inn. And there's an older advert from it from the 60s, I think. It was W.G. Ferguson for Castle Douglas that had it. As I was saying, this wee bit here was a house on its own, and there's the Sun Inn sign, literally. Number 25, next door, currently part of the Sun. But this here was the original wheat sheaf pin in Cumnock, which is the answer to one of your other questions. 1935, the inn went in fire, and at that time Cumnock had just established a new fire brigade, so that was one of its first major jobs, was putting the fire out at the wheat sheaf inn. It then became the Snug Bar, and a lot of folk would remember it as the Snug in Cumnock for many years. 1837, it was an Andrew Templeton that ran it, and then it was Hugh Finlay, followed by his son George Finlay. Robert Barrowman then became the landlord up until 1878, and if you know the history of the Royal Hotel, you will realise Robert Barrowman then moved to the Royal, probably expanding. In 1888, it was taken over by a Sarah Hamilton Finlay, and then a George Finlay was next. And then from 1927 onwards, it was owned by John Cree, who lived in a building called Tanyard House, which obviously was down to Tanyard somewhere. It was still known as the Wheat Sheaf in 1943, so the Snug Bar is a more modern name, but it then was taken over and brought through as part of an extended Sun Inn. And there's an earlier representation of it. Number 26, in the corner here. Some of us of a certain vintage will refer to this as the Pearl Assurance corner, because that was the Pearl Assurance office downstairs for many years. But if we go back to the late 1800s, there was a building here beforehand, and it became a ruin. And it was a ruin by 1905, and it's certainly still a ruin up until 1925. And there was a bit of an issue because boys who the school used to sneak into and hide and probably did bad boy things that boys did in those days. I don't know what he did in 1905. So it was a bit of an issue in the town centre, and folk were a bit annoyed about it. The biggest problem was the owner lived in London. He was actually a Cumnock person, but he moved to London and hadn't really bothered with it. So eventually the council bought it for £120. And what they did was they demolished it and they made the road into the square from Lugar Street a bit wider. And then the bit that was left that they didn't need to widen the road, they sold it to the Hunter family, or the Hunter family, for £90. And he built that new offices there. Now, although it was Pearl Assurance, as we all remember it, to start with, it was actually Hugh Hunter's ironmonger and bike shop for a wee while, but it then became Pearl Assurance and the offices of Hunter Falls, who actually died in 2014. In recent years, it's been a variety of things. There was Les Maisons gift shop, definitely maybe gift shop, the psychic shop. There was a hairdresser's called A Head of Hair for a wee while, and since 2018 it's been the 5-star Turkish Barbers. If we go back, when it was still, before it became a ruin, a man Stevenson for Cumnock actually sold black puddings and tripe here, and Hugh Lorimer had a tailor's shop in it. Robert Crawford, who is the brother of one of the owners of Cumnock Chronicle, he owned it for a wee while. And there's a fish and chip shop in it for a period as well. The Clydesdale Bank moved here in 1883 when the building you can see was erected. Now before that, this was the site, well, a long time before that, this was the site of the parish school. The school was built in 1804 at the north side of the square, and incorporated what might have been the old Borough Toll Booth, which probably wasn't much a building. It's not a toll booth as you think of some of the bigger towns and cities or that type of thing. In the school, Winsome Willie, the famous Winsome Willie, connected with Robert Burns, he was a teacher for a number of years. He was born at 10 Poundland in Ochiltree parish, and he was going to train to be a minister, but a vacancy for a schoolmaster job in Ochiltree came up, so I applied for that and became the schoolmaster in Ochiltree. And then once the job in Cumnock came available, I moved to Cumnock to be the schoolmaster here, and his brother Patrick Simpson became the schoolmaster in Ochiltree. Now, Robert Burns and Winsome Willie became friends, and they used to send poems and letters to each other. Robert Burns actually said to Winsome Willie that he should get all his poems, put them together and sell it as a book. But Winsome Willie said, "No, I write for amusement and I will never consent to publish for profit." So there's not actually many of his poems still in existence, but the letter to Burns, I believe, does. So Winsome Willie became the schoolmaster in Cumnock in 1788. He died in 1815, aged 57, and he's actually buried in the graveyard in Bar Hill. And on the gravestone there's an epitaph written by Adam Brown Todd, well-known Cumnock historian and Covenanter type historian. He actually wrote the epitaph, and it says here, "Winsome Willie lies, whose worth in Burns woke equal love, but death which rent the ties on earth have knit them now above." There's also a monument in the graveyard at Ochiltree to Winsome Willie, so if you go down next to the dam, you can have, there's quite a big monument to Winsome Willie and his brother. Now in 1847, the school moved out of this site to a new building at Broombrae on the Bar Hill Road on the opposite side of Green Mill. And what happened was the old school was sold to the Congregational Church, and they took it over and they ran that as a church for a good number of years. Also on this site was Cumnock Jail, which was only there for, well, it was there for a reasonable number of years after the toll booth. And the inspectors came at one point to have a look at it, and this is some of the information from the report. It was a single cell with a grated window opening onto the public street. It didn't have a fireplace, and so in winter it must be very cold. They reckoned it was very insecure because you could actually pass tools and stuff in through the window to whoever was in it. It was actually dry when the inspector came to see it. It was 10 feet long, 8.5 feet broad, and 7 feet high. And it was basically just used as a lock-up house. You didn't actually spend an awful lot of time in it. The locals reckoned there was only ever between 12 to 20 folk a year put in it. However, if you were a beggar and you were looking for somewhere to sleep at night, quite often they would let you use it. I thought it was quite amusing. And if you were actually held in there in prison, you were allowed 2 penny worth of bread and a penny worth of milk each day. And if you wanted to lie down, then it was only straw on the ground. As I say, in 1847, once the school moved out, the Congregational Church moved in there, and they had only started in 1838, meeting originally in the Black Bull. Congregational Church was growing too big for it, so in 1883 they built the Congregational Church across the Lugar Bridge at the bottom of the Wood Road, and they sold the site to the Clydesdale Bank, who was looking for bigger premises. The church sold it for £700, and this building here was erected between 1882 to 84. Now, the architect of this is a John Murdoch, who is an architect from Ayr, which was quite unusual because Clydesdale Bank tended to use their own architects from Glasgow and so on. But the John Murdoch that designed this building is actually John Murdoch designed the Congregational Church at the foot of the Wood Road as well. So I'm not sure whether it was something he dealt in at the time, whereby it was the same architect who did them both, or whatever, but it's a coincidence that they're both the same architect. Unfortunately, Clydesdale Bank moved out in 2017, so downstairs is empty, but upstairs is still offices, originally Hunter Foggs, then William Duncan Accountants, Robin Walker Accountants, and it's currently the accountant that's business run by Russell Cowan. And if you remember the quiz at the start, Up in the top left there on the building, you can see the carving of the tree, and it's actually the coat of arms of Glasgow, the city of Glasgow, which ties in the Clydesdale Bank. Next door to it is a wee gap, and that's GIBB'S Close, and it's named after a local owner who owns some houses down the close. There's roughly about 8 houses down there at one time, and also the lane led to GIBB'S Well, one of the wells that you can go into water. Number 38 originally was built just as a house, and some of the older photographs you can see of the square just shows it totally as a house. And it was probably built by William Walker, who was a coal master, and he owned Balloch Mill pits, which is in the parish of Auchinleck, and he owned obviously a number of miners' houses in about the Duncorner area. He was married to Elizabeth Drummond in 1867, which gives you a sort of idea of the period. So I reckon this house might be about 1867 when it was built. His family were married into the Hood family, who were quite big coal owners as well through Edinburgh direction. And eventually they purchased quite a lot of coal mines down in Wales. And William Walker Hood became a millionaire, probably one of the first millionaires ever to come from Cumnock area. The biggest problem was he was in a train coming back, I think it was for London, and just outside of Swindon. I don't know how it happened, it's never been explained, but the door of the carriage he was in opened and he fell out the train and he died in March 1923. However, by this time, this wasn't occupied as a house as such, because in 1903, the bottom right part was extended out the front and remodelled into a shop, and that was when John Goldie had his business there as a draper's, and a lot of folk in Cumnock still refer to this as Goldie's Corner. After the Goldies, it was Little's, the radio, television and electrical engineer, and then British Relay when I was a boy, and for many years it's actually been occupied as hairdressers and barbers and so on. An old advert there for Goldies. This is the corner where I suppose you could say it's the Bar Hill Road or Hamilton Place joins into the square. But although it's technically not the square, through that gap at one point, as you can see here, was a wee row of houses. If you just go back there, you can see where the corner, the MERCAT on the right and Goldie's on the left. There's this wee gable end, and that was McKerra's bookshop, cobblers or whatever. And that's the original Hamilton Place. Now, I stuck this in because it's quite an interesting story. Thomas Richard was a Covenanter, Covenanting family from Muirkirk, Greenock Mains farm, and the soldiers were out looking for Covenanters and went to his house, and he was captured as a suspected Covenanter and brought into Cumnock. Now, whether he was put in the jail, which would just be to the left in the square, or that I don't know, but he was brought out, and just in this area, in the square there, was where he was shot. And folks say that the bullet from the shooting went into the gable end of McKerra's boot and shoe shop, and there's a mark up in the gable end for many years marking that. Now, that wee building there was demolished in 1903, and that was when they built the new row of shops that went from Goldie's right along to the double-storey building you can see at the back end at the bottom of that hill there. Down the left-hand side was another wee close, and that was Murdoch's Lane, which is a name that doesn't exist much new to Cumnock when you think about it. Going on to the east side of the square, the last side there, in this photograph you can see the building with the gable end facing the square and 2 wee shops at the bottom, which isn't actually the same building that's on the MERCAT corner that you can see. But originally that there was James Davidson had a saddler in the left hand one, and then after him it was John Davidson, the saddler, probably his son. The one next door, number 40, and you can see how the difference is there, was Grace Sampson, who had a dressmaker and fancy goods, but it was always owned by the Crichtons of Hillside House, and in 1906 they demolished that wee building and they rebuilt it as this here, which is at the corner of the bay frontage to the left hand side of what would be the Black Bull Hotel at the time. Again, it was Provost Richmond, the builder and architect that designed and built this here. But obviously it was part of the Black Bull Hotel by that time. And here's an earlier picture. Probably you can see it's a thatched roof on the left hand side. As also you can see in front of the Black Bull building there, it didn't have the flat wide porch, it just had a small porch with a kind of curvature area where the horses could pull in to let folk off. So the Black Bull Hotel, as we would remember it in our youth, or the MERCAT Hotel as it was up until fairly recent years. Now if you go back to the 1830s, which is the earliest I can confirm the owners, it was a James Murray. Now that James Murray was the same Murray that later owned the Dumfries Arms Hotel. He was there up until the 1850s, and up until the 1860s it was a John Douglas that was the owner. And then a Graham Ramage, Thomas Adam, then it was Mrs. Adams, and Archibald Myron, somebody Urquhart, Thomas Ross. It seems to have passed through for a number of folk over the years. But by the 1906, as I say, Hugh Hamilton Crichton of Hillside House, he actually owned it and had various folk in managing it for him. Mrs. Davidson, and then James Davidson had it after that. In 1910, James Henry owned it, and so on. In 2015, Robert Kyle and the Rad Hotel Group took it on, and obviously we all know it's been extended into the Royal Hotel. Quite interesting, some of the older adverts you can find. If you look at the bottom there, Mr. Bryan visits the Black Bull Hotel Cumnock every Wednesday from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. So if you're needing to go to the dentist, you went to your local hotel. And whether they had the whiskey in hand for anaesthetic, I don't know, but that was where the dentist came to visit you. Interesting wee building in the middle, number 43. And the earliest I've got, this was David Batchy Smith, the baker. And this was a wee baker's shop. And by later on that century, up until 1891, David Boyd had it. And he sold hats and hosiery. And in 1891, Robert Craig took over. He came from MERCAT to take on the business, and he continued to sell hats and so on. But latterly, this was John McGrady's boot and shoe shop, and it was McGrady's, and then Sam McGrady and so on for many years. In 2005, Bruce's Nurseries had it, and it's Bruce's Nurseries in the picture here. And obviously, this is now the main front door to into the Royal Hotel. And there again, you can see down the bottom, John McGrady next to the Black Bull. And not only does he tell he's next to the Black Bull, so you don't mix him up with James McGrady. The John is underlined. A slightly later advert. The bit next door is the original Royal Hotel, but before it was the Royal Hotel, this was the Eagle Inn. Now in 1837, Peter Black was the host of the Eagle Inn, and then after that it was the Clyme or the Clyme family who were butchers. So Hugh Clyme had it, and it was Mary Clyme, and roughly 1850, John, he died in 1884. Now, John McCowan was actually, it then became the Royal Hotel for a shortly after he gave it up, and James Guthrie had it as a Royal Hotel to start with. And then, as I said earlier, Robert Barrowman, and as time moved on, it was Robert Barrowman's and then became Stevenson's of Chan. And we trip there, that was how they converted the downstairs part into the milk bar and restaurant. It's now part of the bigger Royal Hotel. The Royal Hotel itself occupies the big bit in the corner, the main bit here. It was extended a couple of times, the Royal Hotel, under the Barrowman's ownership. And this building here was probably erected in 1892. And when they built that in 1892, they moved it back from the side of the street by 3.5 feet to allow the gap between there and what was still the old commercial bank on the other side, to give it a wider gap to get out into Clydesdale Street. The Barrowmans had the hotel for a number of years, but the Barrowmans went bankrupt and eventually it was sold and moved on to someone else. Before this building was built in 1892, there was an older block on that corner. This is Robert Barrowman's initials. It's above the door in the Royal. You can see there in the old original door in Clydesdale Street. And this is an old booklet, smaller than postcard size, but it's about 12 pages, telling you some of the things to come and visit and see in the Cumnock area. And as you can see, it was referred to as the Hotel Royal at that time. And I can remember quite a few older folk in Cumnock talking about the Hotel Royal rather than the Royal Hotel. But before that building was built in the corner in 1892, there was Carruthers, I don't know how to say it, boot and shoe shop in that corner there as you go out into Clydesdale Street. And before that, it was actually Hugh Kennedy who had a boot and shoe shop there as well. And he had a workshop down in Tower Street, so the two different places. The John Carruthers, who was a shoemaker and had the shop here, he was also a provost of Cumnock at one time. And when the place was rebuilt, he moved into the new shoe shop down the stairs of the Royal, which then became Mary Hannah's shoe shop, and then it was Shoe Fair, and in recent years it was actually occupied by an accountant who Robert Kyle's offices and so on. An old advert there for Hugh Kennedy, it was in the same building. Seems to be shoe shops everywhere come up at one time. And then same building there, but later owner, John Carruthers. In the square, I'm not really going to tell you much about all the different bits in the centre. I'll just pass over them fairly quickly because it's not to do with the shops and the buildings around the outside I was talking about. But obviously the Market Cross, well-known part of the Cumnock. The date on one side says it was 1703 and repaired in 1778. Now Cumnock became a borough in 1509. So technically we were allowed to have a market cross in 1509 to indicate that to passing trade and so on. So whether there was an older cross of some sort that was replaced by this one in 1703, nobody's really confirmed anything. Where it was has varied. As I say, it used to be in the northeast corner, which is the kind of Black Bull corner of the square at one time. Folk say it's good in Townhead Street, where the cross is marked in wee bray, just at the east end of the middle of Townhead Street. And then it came back to the square and was outside the church door. And then when they redid the square, when it was pedestrianised, they moved it into the corner where it currently sits. And the coat of arms that's on it there belongs to the Earl of Dumfries, because at that time it was a Crichton family and hadn't married into the Stuarts of Bute to become the Marquesses of Bute. At one point, if you look at some of the old photographs of the Market Cross in Cumnock, you'll see there's a lamp standard in the top of it. Quite handy thing to stick it on. And that was a gas light, and it was there up until 1911. In 1925, believe it or not, The council thought they would shift it out of the square, and they thought they would stick it at the bottom of Cairn Road, where the flats are. Well, the flats obviously weren't there at the time, but that was the idea where they put it. And the reason that they chose that is because that was where Cumnock Market was at that time. So they thought, well, that's where the market is. Let's stick the market close at the bottom of Cairn Road. But that didn't happen. And in 1935, Historic Scotland's predecessor, the Ministry of Works, made it an ancient monument. And there's a photograph to show you what it was like with the glass top on it. And it was lit up by gaslight. And you can see the old building before the Royal on the left and the old building before the commercial bank on the right hand side. More up to date picture. Also in the corner at the top of the pond steps is the Victoria Fountain, erected to celebrate Victoria's Jubilee. But that was originally on the square on the east side of the church, facing the Royal Hotel. And it then got moved out of there and was stuck up at Gemmell Avenue area, and then nobody ever saw it up there, so they brought it back down to the pond steps and they stuck it in the corner there. Parish church itself, built between 1864 and 1866. Architect of it was James Maitland Wardrop, who was an Edinburgh architect. The stone is a very distinctive local stone. It's Colburn stone, so that means it was quarried at the Colburn quarries at New Cumnock, and a lot of Cumnock early local buildings were built with that colour of stone. And the main reason was, well, it was the Marquis of Bute that owned the quarries, and it was John Murdoch that ran the quarries, and John Murdoch had a lot of business in Cumnock, so when there was a lot of building work going on, he used the stone from his own quarry, hence the colour. So if you're looking at buildings, you can quite often tell their age, because later on, by the 1890s and so on, it was the Ballochmyle sandstone that became more common. But the church here, obviously built in 1864, replaced the old church of 1754, and that was designed by Robert Adam. Robert Adam, the same person that designed the Dumfries House, and the church and the Dumfries House are actually almost contemporary. This here has 700 seats when it was built, but it wasn't big enough. And in 1822, if you look on the left hand side there, you can see the outside stairs. Well, there was outside stairs on the left, the right, and on the back added. And the reason they were added is because they stuck in lofts upstairs so that more folk could actually get into the church. When the present church was built, there was a plan to put a steeple on the corner, and this is what it was supposedly going to look like. It's a very poor image, obviously. I tried to track down the original, but that's what the church in the square was planned to look like. But unfortunately, the Marquis of Bute became a Catholic after this, so he built the chapel at the bottom of Glazenock Street, and it wasn't until William Allison Cunningham of Logan House in 1872 decided to donate the bell and the clock, sorry, not the bell, just the clock, to the square, so they had to rebuild the tower a wee bit to allow the clock to be added. The square was closed as a graveyard in 1768. However, as I say, it was originally a graveyard to start with. A few burials were still allowed, and the last person buried in the square was Hugh Logan of that ilk, who died in 1802. Now, Hugh Logan, if you're into Burns, you maybe know him as the Laird of Logan, and he was quite a major wit at the time. A lot of kind of humorous anecdotes attributed to him, and he obviously lived at Logan House, which is where Logan is nowadays. So he was the last person to actually be buried in the square, and that's because the Logans had this burial place. And basically, where he's buried is outside the church on the corner next to the MERCAT corner. Cumnock bus station area was in the square up until 1966, when we moved it down to the bus stands in the Tanyard. and after that it was pedestrianised in 1974. So that was the other answer to your question when the other half of the square was shut off. And this is a picture of working farmers market in fairly recent times. Something that maybe we should encourage because it looks quite nice, and I think the square's the ideal setting as a marketplace. Oh, sorry. So here's the answers. The sign at the beginning is on the side of the Royal Hotel. It's been repainted in black and gold just now. The CTC stands for the Cyclist Touring Club, which means that they actually recommended the Royal Hotel as a place to stay. The equivalent to AARAC Rosettes at that time. The newest building is what we would call RD Hunters. It was closed to traffic on Sunday, the 2nd of June 1974. The carving is up in the Clydesdale Bank, and it's actually the Glasgow coat of arms. The other coat of arms belongs to the Ellerden Fries in the Market Cross. The Wheatsheaf Inn was in the snug bar of the Sun Inn. The Glasgow House is the big 3-storey building, and the site of Cumnock Jail is now occupied by what was the Clydesdale Bank, because that's changed already. And the first tar macadam was laid in the square in April 1909. I think that's us finished. Thank you very much.